This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see all these virtual attendees. I don't know how many are actually in the theatre. I can't see that, but I can certainly see a very large number of people coming in from all parts of the globe. So welcome. Look, it's a great pleasure to introduce Carmen to give this talk this afternoon. Carmen's PhD work had its antecedents in some work she did for her PhD, looking at the issue of the prevalence and perhaps some of the causes of mistreatment of animals, of domestic animals, dogs in particular. And it's progressed through the vagaries of COVID and solving technical problems and all the rest of it, as many PhDs have done over this last few years, to what I think is an outstanding piece of work. And I hope that when you hear her talk, you'll agree with me. Just a bit of background on Carmen, though. Not only did she get first class honours and was on the Dean's honours list for her fourth year work, but since then, and I can't really enumerate all the achievements because there are so many, it would take up pretty much the hour, but over the course of this last few years, she's published 4 papers with another one just in press, and there'll be yet another one from a PhD a little bit later on. She's received innumerable awards. I mean, apart from the Dean's honours list, she won several Best Presentation Awards. She has received grants for travel and for research support throughout the course of her candidature. She won the People's Choice for her 3-minute thesis presentation, and on and on. I mean, there, as I say, there are just so many of these. She's also found time throughout the course of all of this to volunteer in a whole range of capacities, particularly in relation to animal welfare, and so it's really been a complete set of activities and achievements throughout this 3 or 4 years of her candidature. I won't go any further than that, but it is a great pleasure to introduce her this afternoon, and she's going to try and summarize this huge breadth of work in a matter of 45 minutes, I guess, on the topic that she's giving this afternoon: cruelty, from cruelty to suboptimal care, working towards the prevention of dog welfare problems, and in particular addressing something which has been at the back of people's thinking for some time, but has never really been progressed, and that's this idea of duty of care towards companion animals. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Carmen.
Thank you so much, Graham, for those kind words. I think we're good to go. Excellent. So just before we get into things, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are here today on what has always been and always will be Wurundjeri land. I'd also like to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to be presenting today has been conducted on various lands across Victoria, including Wurundjeri, Bunurong, Wadawurrung, Brayakalang, Ladji and Dja Dja Wurrung country. So I pay my respects to all elders, past, present and emerging. So most people consider that in the scheme of things, pets have it pretty good. But I'm hoping that if you're here today, you've got some sense already that all is not sunshine and roses for our furry friends. Simplistically, we can think of dog welfare as existing on a spectrum from very bad to very good. And our dogs face a range of different challenges along this spectrum, from things like cruelty and neglect, relinquishment, mismanagement, which can lead to behavioural problems, and also just suboptimal care, which can lead to chronic loneliness, boredom, and depression. But despite the breadth of challenges our dogs face, really it all comes down to one thing, and that's human behaviour. So it logically follows that perhaps the best avenue we have to improve the lives of dogs is human behaviour change. And we can do this through behaviour change interventions. Now, behaviour change as a discipline or as a science is really prolific in other fields like health psychology, where they're interested in preventable diseases. But here in our animal-related fields, it really is still a fledgling discipline. We've got a lot of really good information out there on the human-animal relationship and attitudes towards animals and the like, but comparatively few studies actually then go on to developing an intervention and evaluating it. So just to demonstrate this quickly, as part of a starting point for all of this work, we conducted a structured review of any behaviour change intervention in animal care or interactive settings. So this could have been any species, any behaviour, provided it related to some sort of caring for animals or interacting with them. And after screening over 1,500 papers, we only found 47 that actually did this. So that just goes to show you how young this field is compared to, say, health psychology, in which there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these papers. But the good news is that we can borrow from these more advanced fields, and particularly when it comes to the process of design and evaluation of interventions, because it's not necessarily content specific. So one of the things we can borrow is this 10-task guide. So this is by Grahame and Denford, and essentially it's a best practice guide to developing and evaluating behaviour change interventions. And this in itself was also developed from the work of Bartholomew's intervention mapping approach. So in that review paper I was just talking about before, we used this 10-task guide as a way to assess various design and evaluation elements of those 47 studies. And while I don't have time to go into all of these things today, if you do have an interest in this area, I would highly recommend you check out this paper. But essentially, a lot of the problems we found came down to jumping in at the design stage without doing enough foundational research to understand what's the problem, how big is it, who's contributing to it the most, what specific drivers do we need to, specific behaviours and drivers of those behaviours do we need to target? And also, how can psychological theory help us to develop more effective intervention programs? So to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak, that's exactly what I did in my PhD. It's focus on these early steps, what we call elicitation research, because it may seem quicker and easier to just jump in at the design stage and build an intervention and see if it works. We can be risking wasting significant time and resources on an intervention that doesn't work or isn't fit for purpose. Also, it can be very difficult to evaluate interventions if we don't have a strong baseline. So essentially, my PhD has consisted of 4 main studies, which we'll look at today to understand various aspects of this elicitation research. So we started off looking at the prevalence of mistreatment in the community, moving on to community attitudes, then focusing in on this concept of duty of care, and finally some field work. So that's what we're going to be going through today. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So this first study was conducted in collaboration with the RSPCA Victoria and with a grant that they received from the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions. And essentially what we wanted to do here was understand the scale and nature of animal mistreatment in the community. So we're talking about cruelty and neglect here. Because if we go back to our spectrum of harms, really we have some good evidence on this end of the spectrum with some good representative surveys done of management behaviours and such. But down this end, essentially all we've had to go on so far is reports that have been made to the RSPCA. And also, while the majority of my PhD was focused specifically on dogs, this study was looking at all animals because we wanted to get a broader picture and also be able to compare the different species. So we know that 60,000 reports of animal mistreatment are made to the RSPCA every year. And 11,000 of those reports are made here in Victoria. And when you look more closely at these data, we often find that there are areas with high rates of reports consistently and areas with low rates of reports. And so these trends often get eaten up by the media, and you see a lot of these articles like cruelty hotspots and calling them out. And naturally you might think, okay, great, that's a target. That's an intervention target that we can try and address and fix the problem. But we don't actually know how reflective these report rates are of true prevalence of mistreatment. In fact, it could even be that areas with high rates of reports actually care more about animals, and so are therefore more likely to report it when they see something wrong. Essentially, we thought this was a bit of an iceberg problem. What we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg with a whole lot that hasn't been accounted for. So we conducted the first representative telephone survey, looking at essentially what people had seen in their community and then what they did about it. Now, just quickly for any interstate or international viewers we have joining us here today, Victoria is one of 8 states and territories that makes up Australia. And while it may seem small, it is the second most populated. The state is then also broken down into 79 local government areas, and these local government areas are classified as either metropolitan, regional, interface, or rural. So with that in mind, overall, we surveyed 1,801 individuals from 6 different local government areas, 2 regional cities, 2 interface areas or urban fringe type areas, and 2 metropolitan regions. Now, the reason we did this instead of doing a statewide survey was so we could look at some of those trends that I was talking about before, because if we did just a statewide blanket survey, you wouldn't get a big enough sample size in the different regions to make meaningful comparisons. So within those different region types, we then selected one local government area that over the past 3 years had consistently high rates of reports, so these cruelty hotspots, so to speak. And then we paired them based on population and socioeconomic index with a similar area that had consistently low rates of reports. So we had these matched pairs. So what did we find? Well, overall, we found that 26% of people had witnessed at least one, often many more, instances of mistreatment in the past year. That's 1 in 4 people. That's a lot. And the most common types of mistreatment they recalled witnessing were underweight animals, having too many animals to provide for them appropriately, and inappropriate living conditions. So that might be heavily soiled areas, being tethered constantly, or not having appropriate shelter. So the majority of the problem was essentially just not providing for an animal's basic needs. And this is consistent with what we see in the reports. So for each type of mistreatment a participant recalled witnessing, we asked them what they did about it. And as you can see here, while the majority of people did something, there was still a significant portion of people who did not. Now, another thing I want to draw your attention to as well is this, that only 9% of people actually reported what they'd seen to the RSPCA Victoria. Now, that's pretty concerning, seeing as RSPCA Victoria is the primary enforcement body for animal mistreatment in this state. And if we think back to our iceberg image, and if we know that 11,000 reports are made to RSPCA each year, but if only 9% of people are reporting them, then that suggests to me that we have a pretty big problem sitting here under the surface. Now let's have a look at those localized trends. So between our matched pairs of a cruelty hotspot, so to speak, and a low reporting region, we actually found no difference in either the number of people who had witnessed mistreatment or the separate number of incidents they'd seen. Effectively, they had the same reported prevalence. So this confirmed our suspicions that report rates are not necessarily representative of prevalence within a given region. In fact, it may suggest that we should be looking at those areas with low rates of reports because they may have just as many issues going on, but just aren't telling anyone about it, and then the animals aren't getting the help they need. Where we did find a difference, though, was between our region types. We found that participants in our regional cities record witnessing 2.5 and 3 times more separate incidents of mistreatment than those in our interface and metropolitan regions. Now, there's a whole host of reasons why this might be, but possibly the most likely is that the regional areas we surveyed were our most socioeconomically disadvantaged regions. And we know from the literature that there is a link between disadvantage and neglect. So to summarize that, for that first study, unfortunately, mistreatment is common and it's underreported. It's also mostly neglect. We have some areas that do have higher prevalence than others, but we need to remember that report rates are not necessarily reflective of prevalence within a given region. So we need to be careful interpreting those when it comes to identifying targets for interventions. So that was just scratching the surface. We did also look at attitudes towards reporting and stuff like that. So if you'd like to read more about that, you can check out the published paper. So then the next logical step is, well, why the trends? Why do we have some areas that have more mistreatment than others, and some areas that don't have a higher prevalence, but they do report more? So as you often do with social issues, we looked at community attitudes. Do they reflect the observed trends, suggesting they have some sort of role to play in the underlying behaviour? And could they be targets for an intervention? So here we are moving along then to my second study of my PhD. Now, while I am calling this a separate study because it is a separate paper and a separate chapter of my thesis, it was conducted in the same survey as that first one. So all the methods and everything from that first one about local government areas and all the rest, that still applies here. So essentially we had 2 main research questions. Do areas of high reporting have more positive attitudes towards animals and so are therefore more likely to report it? And do areas of high prevalence have more negative attitudes towards animals and so therefore have a lower standard of care? So what sort of attitudes should we be looking at though? Well, we conducted a literature review and did some preliminary focus groups. And these were the variables that we found were most likely to be influential. So just quickly to run through them. Firstly, we had the concern for the mistreatment of animals. So this was really based off the work of Bill Henry. And essentially we're just asking, on a scale of 0 to 10, how concerned would you be about a range of different issues? And we broke these down for different species, cat, horse, and dog, so that we could compare them as well. Second, we had valuing animals. Now, this was a really strong theme that came out in our focus groups. So most of these items are taken directly from those focus groups, and they're just general agreement type questions. Then we had affection towards animals. This is essentially just how much they liked these different species on a scale of 0 to 10. And then finally, we had attitudes towards caring for their own animals. And so this is modeled off the theory of planned behavior, which is a very prominent psychological model and includes behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and perceived behavioral control. So our first question, did high reporting areas have more positive attitudes than low reporting areas? Well, they didn't differ in their concern for mistreatment of animals, nor did they value animals anymore, but they did have slightly higher affection for animals, and they did have slightly more positive normative beliefs. So normative beliefs are a personal perception of social pressures. So perhaps in these high reporting areas, we have more social pressure to provide a high level of care. And so then when people aren't providing that, they're more likely to call it out and report it. Our second question was then whether areas of high prevalence have more negative attitudes towards animals. And they did have slightly less concern for the mistreatment of cats specifically. They didn't value any animals any less, nor did they have any less affection for them, but they also did have slightly lower attitudes towards caring for their own animals. So that makes sense. So overall, we found several small but significant effects that supported our hypotheses. But something I don't have time to go into today is that we also found a number of complex interactions between gender, location, species, and report rates. And finally, it's also important to note that while we did have significant effects, they did only account for a small amount of variance between the regions. So essentially what that means is there's a lot more going on that we're not explaining. So essentially we can conclude that community attitudes are important, but it's complicated. But even though it is complicated, we do have some good pointers from this research. Interventions should have clear targets when it comes to the audience, the desired behaviour, the relevant species, and report rates, because attitudes vary across these different things. On that note, targeting smaller areas is likely to be more effective, and taking the time to understand their unique challenges and strengths as well will be more effective. Community engagement and qualitative research will be really necessary to get this sort of in-depth understanding. And finally, because community attitudes are so complex, we need to accept that targeting them at the community level may only lead to small changes and take time for changes to be seen. Again, just scratching the surface here. If you'd like to read more about that, there is the published paper. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to go from looking at the macro level, the community level, to focusing in on the individual. We're also going to switch from looking at drivers of mistreatment to drivers of care, because essentially in our intervention programs, that's what we're going to be wanting to promote, is care. And finally, we're going to switch from looking at all animals to just focusing in on dogs, because they are our most common companion animal species in Australia, and they're also the most commonly reported for mistreatment. So, what motivates people to provide care for their animals? It's a big question. Well, in my honours year, we developed this pet care competency model, and this is really based off the work of Grahame, Coleman and Paul Hemsworth and their human-animal relationship model, which has had a lot of success and empirical support in the livestock industries. So we used that, and then also drew on several existing psychological models to develop this sort of bespoke map of the types of things that may influence carer behaviour and dog welfare. Now, I know there's a lot going on here. Don't need to look at it all. What we're going to focus on today is this part here, duty of care, because this is really the unique aspect that this model introduced. So what do I mean by duty of care? You've all probably heard the term, and it does have a very specific legal and a definition, and it's used a lot in animal protection discourse, but that's not what I'm talking about. Our approach to duty of care is conceptualizing it as a motivational or psychological construct, essentially reflecting a person's feelings of moral obligation to provide care for their animal. So moral obligations are a distinct concept in psychology, and they're distinct from other things that we often look at, like attitudes and beliefs. And they're linked to moral emotions, particularly things like guilt and pride. And these emotions can work as behavioural reinforcers. So just like dog treats in dog training, you fulfill your obligation, you feel good, you feel proud. That in itself is a reinforcing experience, and you're more likely to repeat the action. So in this way, they provide this sort of intrinsic motivation to provide care for their animal, which can be more self-sustaining than extrinsic influences. So that was the fastest rundown of duty of care and motivation I've ever given. So we have a whole paper on that model and developing it and everything. So if you're interested in that, please do check that out. So that brings me to the third study of my PhD. So focusing in on this concept of duty of care, having a more thorough investigation of what is it, and also developing a psychometric scale to measure it. Because really, if we want to do a good experimental research to see if it's influential in behaviour and welfare, we need robust ways to measure it. So if you've ever filled out one of those Big 5 personality questionnaires or the depression and anxiety scale or anything like that, that's what we're talking about, developing a concise questionnaire that measures an underlying psychological construct. So during the preliminary stages of this process, we found that our original conceptual definitions of duty of care really resonated strongly with this norm activation model. So this was a psychological model developed by Schwartz back in the 70s, and it was used to predict pro-social behaviour specifically. And it centres around feelings of moral obligation as the primary motivator for behaviour. Sound familiar? So we adopted this model as a framework for understanding the different aspects of duty of care and how they may work together. So just quickly, we'll go through the model. In short, it begins with an activation process, and that in itself moves through several steps, including an initial awareness of a problem or a party in need, followed by an individual's identification of actions to relieve that need or problem, and that's called efficacy. And then one's belief in their own ability to perform those actions. And finally, a sense of responsibility for the consequences of either the problem or the consequences of not acting. This then leads through to the obligation stage, which centers around these personal norms, which we call duty beliefs because it's a little bit more intuitive. And they're essentially one's beliefs about how they ought to behave in a certain situation or their beliefs about their duties. Now, combined with those emotions I was talking about before, like guilt and pride, they then lead to these feelings of moral obligation. So an important thing to note, though, is that you can have duty beliefs or personal norms, but it's not until they're activated by these things that they become these feelings of moral obligation, which are the motivating factor. Once you have those feelings of moral obligation, there's then a range of defense mechanisms that, okay, I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, no worries. Let's get rid of that. Oh, good. Okay. Great. Just to jazz things up a little bit. So you've got a range of defense mechanisms that can then be employed to neutralize these feelings of moral obligation if the costs of acting outweigh the benefits. And then finally, you have action or inaction. So these different elements essentially formed our a priori dimensions for scale development, essentially a framework for us to develop it around. So the scale development process is quite complex and long, and I'm not going to go into it in much detail today because I think for a general audience, nobody cares about psychometrics. So essentially what we're doing here, we did a literature review and conducted individual interviews to develop a big pool of questions that could potentially go in our scale and fit around those different dimensions of the norm activation model. You then deliver that big bunch of questions. So we had 135 potential questions. You deliver them as a survey, and we did that online to a large group of people before you conduct statistical analyses called factor analysis to distill that big pool of questions down into a manageable number that still captures the underlying psychological constructs. You then test the model as a whole using what we call structural equation modeling, and then do a bunch of reliability and validity checks. So essentially, we made a scale. There's 30 items, 5 subscales that essentially capture different aspects of that norm activation model. And this is the model as a whole. For those of you who are statistically inclined, the model fit parameters are over there in the corner. But essentially, the model fits and there's good relationships between the different elements. Now, we did find a lot of interesting things about how they all relate together, but I don't have time to go into them today. One thing, though, I will talk about is that from the people that we recruited, that we spoke to in our interviews and in the survey, the majority of them had high levels of duty beliefs, well, relatively high levels of duty beliefs. So that could be a product of sampling bias, sampling just people who are more engaged with dog welfare and that sort of thing. But given the prevalence of dog welfare problems out there in the community, particularly those sort of suboptimal care issues, it's highly unlikely that we didn't capture people who had dogs with welfare problems. So that suggests to me that perhaps the problem isn't with these duty beliefs, but more so the activation type factors. So just something to think about. So the next step in scale development process is something called predictive validity. Does duty of care, or the components of it, actually influence owner behaviour and subsequently dog welfare? So to do this, that's a big undertaking. You have to look at duty of care and the owner behaviour, and dog welfare at the same time. So to do that, you need to go out into the field. And so that brings me along to my last study, the field work. So for this study, we aimed to recruit a big bunch of dog owners and do in-home visits to assess dog welfare in the home environment and also assess those duty of care constructs at the same time. So we're going to do things like physical health assessment, a cognitive bias test, hair cortisol, and using remote monitoring technology to monitor their behaviour and physiology over time. And then this little friend came along. And the problem that COVID presented was not only that I couldn't go into people's homes and assess their dogs, but more fundamentally, I was interested in the drivers of human behaviour. But at this time, human behaviour wasn't normal and it wasn't within an individual's control. So we had to scrap that and think about what I could study that wouldn't be affected by COVID restrictions. So we honed in on this concept of problem awareness, one of those activation factors from the previous study. So this is looking at the relationship between an owner's perception of dog welfare and actual dog welfare measures, objective measures. And this still fits within the broader story of my PhD, as I was just saying. It's also an interesting topic as well, because a lot of dog welfare work does actually rely on owner reports of either behaviour or welfare, because it's just so hard to get into people's homes and do welfare assessments. So often we're resource constrained and we have to rely on owner reports. So this is an interesting line of work from that perspective as well. So this was the primary research question. How do objective measures of dog welfare relate to perceptions of dog welfare? But how do we objectively assess dog welfare when we can't access them because of COVID? Well, thankfully, I'd already organised this remote monitoring technology for the previous iteration of the study. So this was based off the work of Heidi Ortmeyer and Associates, who's been an absolute gem throughout this whole process and really helped me out. And she kind of pioneered this approach, combining pet pace collars and actigraph link monitors. So let's have a look at what they do. So this is the pet pace collar, as modeled by my little furry friend here. Essentially, it's like a Fitbit for dogs. It measures activity, position, fever, pulse, the respiration, and heart rate variability. Heart rate variability was what I was and it can sample this every 30 minutes, 15 minutes, or 2 minutes. So I had it on the most intense setting every 2 minutes. So while I could monitor this in real time, the owners didn't have access to this information until after the study was finished, just in case it affected their perceptions. So one fundamental question we need to ask them is, well, do these pet pace measures actually equal welfare? Individually, no. We know that animal welfare is a multifaceted construct, and the best welfare assessment protocols integrate a range of different measures to get a more rounded perspective of the animal's experience. So it's important that while I will be talking in a minute about these measures independently because of the statistics, we also need to take a step back and look at them as a whole. It's also preferable to supplement them with more other behavioural or physiological measures. And we did do this. We used the Canine Behavioural and Research Questionnaire, but I just don't have time to go into the results of that today. And we also looked at hair cortisol, and we just haven't been able to get into the lab yet. So then moving on to the actigraph, what does it do? Essentially, primarily it's an accelerometer to look at activity, but it also has this really cool Bluetooth proximity function, where you can set one up as a receiver and the others up as beacons, and essentially they talk to each other. And you can calculate the distance between them. And it samples this every 30 seconds. So we had one on the dog and then the owners wearing the others on their wrists. So then we could calculate the amount of time they spent together in close proximity. So this then added a second layer to our study where we could ask, does time spent with the dog moderate the relationship between objective measures and perceptions? And is there any direct effect on perceptions as well? So we've got our dog welfare measures, we've got our time spent, now we just need our perception measures. So we did this in a couple of ways to be safe. Firstly, we had the problem awareness scale from the previous study, essentially just asking if their dog's welfare could be improved. Then we had a general rating, which was done at the start of the study before the remote monitoring period. So we asked them in general, can you rate your dog's welfare, mental state, and physical health? And then we had daily ratings. So each night at 8 p.m, they would receive a text message like this with a little link to then go and rate their dog's welfare, those same 3 things for the previous 24 hours. So the data collection period went on for 2 weeks, and they wore those devices continuously, except on charging days, 3, 6, 9, and 12. But we couldn't do them all at once because we didn't have enough equipment. So we ran them in cohorts of 10 dogs at a time. And this ran from October last year through to February this year. So in the end, after receiving 325 expression of interest, we had 50 dogs and 85 owners complete the study. They were all single dog households to control for the effect of other dogs in the household, and all adults in the household had to participate. We only had 3 households that had children, and they only had 1 child each, and they were very young, so we didn't monitor them. So we had a good range of ages and genders for the humans. And as for the dogs, as you can see, we had a good range of breeds, sizes, and age. They ranged in age from 1 to 14 with an average of 5.5. So over the 2-week period, with the pet pace collars sampling every 2 minutes and the actigraph monitors sampling every 30 seconds, we ended up with over 40,000 lines of data for each individual dog. So then we needed a way to format that and bring that together in a more manageable way. So thankfully, my brother, who's an absolute gem, was able to write a program in Python to actually pull this together, remove the charging times and that sort of thing. So thank you so much, Lachlan, for your help on that. So then our data had this nested structure with repeated measures. So for those who are statistically inclined, again, we use linear mixed models to analyze it. So what did we find? So first of all, we'll look at the daily ratings. So what these tell us is day to day, whether changes in the dog's measures lead to changes in their owner's perceptions. So we found no relationship for any of the physiological measures. We found no effect of time spent either on the moderating relationship or the direct relationship, but we did find a consistent effect of activity. So just clean things up a bit there. So we've got activity there. Essentially, on days that the dog was more active, it would rate higher on welfare, mental health, and physical health. So that kind of makes sense. Now onto our general measures, the one-off ratings, these done at the start. These tell us about something slightly different. These tell us about the variation between dogs. So again, we found no effect of physiology. We found no effect of the time spent with the owner. But again, we found this consistent effect of activity. So more active dogs were rated better in their overall welfare, their physical health, and lower in problem awareness. They were perceived to have less of a problem, but it didn't relate to their mental state. So to summarize that, essentially day-to-day changes in an individual's dog's activity led to small changes in their owner's perception of welfare. In general, more active dogs were perceived to have better welfare than less active dogs. But as I said before, we have to step back then and go, okay, is activity reflective of welfare? Well, it might be a good sort of general measure, like in humans, activity is a good general measure of some well-being. It doesn't capture the whole story, does it? So we also have to ask, why did we not see any relationships between any of those physiological measures? Well, firstly, we have to consider, do these physiological measures, are they just not relevant to welfare? but that would actually fly in the face of quite a good body of evidence. I'm going to cross that one out. More likely, while we did see variability in those physiological measures day to day, perhaps these variations were just within normal range and not actually reflective of a change in welfare state. And to understand that, we need more basic research to kind of develop reference ranges for these things, because we don't really have that. And finally, it could be that the physiological measures were reflective of welfare changes, but the visible changes that owners could see in their behaviour or such were just too subtle for them to pick up, or they don't know what to be looking for. So while this has raised a lot of extra questions, I think we can reasonably conclude that owner perceptions seem to capture some of the picture, but not all of it. So what does that mean for our interventions? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, owner problem awareness could probably do with a little bit of improvement, particularly when it comes to more subtle changes. But there is a lot more work we need to do. Is it that owners aren't noticing, or do they not know what to look for? So we've got a master's student starting on some qualitative research. From that same study, we asked owners, what would you be looking out for, and what are signs of good welfare and of poor welfare? So we're going to look at their knowledge in that respect. Also, what things can we actually see in our animals that reflect these sort of internal states, these more subtle states on a day-to-day basis? And so then subsequently, what can we teach owners to look out for other than just activity? So that is my PhD journey. Thank you so much for sticking with me through it all. Just like most research, as I said, it's raised a lot more questions than perhaps it's answered, but I do consider that we have made significant ground on understanding these primary foundational things about the problem of dog welfare, the drivers of it, and potential targets for future interventions. This is obviously just the start, but hopefully if we keep chipping away, we can eventually make a difference for our furry friends, because in the end, that's what this is all about. It's all about improving their lives. So thank you. I'd just like to make a few acknowledgements. My supervisors, first and foremost, while they couldn't be here today, I know they're all online, and thank you so much for your support over these last few years. You really have been the dream team. We've been through a lot, and you've been with me every step of the way. Thank you. My committee chair, Ruth, you've been a gem. My co-authors on those papers, Charles, Beck, and Jen, really appreciate your collaborations. My remote monitoring guardian angel, that Heidi, that last study couldn't have been possible without you, so thank you. And Cameron for his help with those complex linear mixed models on that last study. The funding, oh, I forgot to mention, that last study was funded by RSPCA Australia through their Alan White Scholarship Program and through a U4 small project grant. So thank you to those two, but also thank you to everyone else for the funding. We can't do research without it. The Animal Welfare Science Centre, an awesome, you're my work family, and I really appreciate the support. The faculty and Aaron, thank you so much for making all of this happen today. As I said, we're new to this whole hybrid situation, so the support is great. And finally, of course, my partner and my family, you guys are my rock, and I wouldn't be here without you, so thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to take questions now. If we don't get time to answer your question though, or if you think of something later, my email address is there and my Twitter handle, so you can always email me or tweet me. Thank you.
Okay. We have comments. Well done, Carmen. Great work. Great work. Well done, Carmen, especially with COVID and those random interruptions today. Talk about those later. An amazing body of work. Congratulations. Very nice presentation.
That's all right.
We don't have any questions as yet, but I think people are just putting them together.
Yeah, it takes time to type. Does anybody audience here have any questions? Yes. We have a roving mic as well.
Fantastic work. Brilliant series of investigations and fine presentations. Really impressive and fascinating to see your summary today. go. Another question?
Just check. It's a great presentation, Carmen. Just have a question in relation to my field of work. I work in biosecurity, and I just wanted you to have a comment on the applicability of your work in other areas, such as biosecurity, and getting people to do the right thing when it comes to preventing disease. That sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the specific content of interventions really does need to be targeted to particular behaviours. There's different drivers for every different behaviour that you find. Even within dog care, there's going to be differences between people and between behaviours. So while the sort of process that we go through to develop interventions and to understand the drivers of them is definitely applicable to more than one field, we're all humans and it's all human behaviour at the end of it. The specifics are really what need to be honed in on in different situations.
We have a question online. What would you ideally like to work on to continue to this work in the next 3 years? That's from Mia.
Good question, Mia. Essentially, what we need to look at now is what are the specific behaviours of dog owners that we need to change. Because, it's all well and good to say, okay, dogs need exercise, dogs need this, dogs need that. The specifics of that is really important. How much exercise do they need? Do we need to be promoting people to be walking them once a day, twice a day? Does it change for individual dogs? What are the specific things that we need to target? Because as I was just saying in response to the other question, drivers change for different behaviours. So identifying the sorts of behaviours that we need to be targeting, and then essentially developing and trialling an intervention. You never know until, you can do lots of foundational work to really set yourself up for the best chance of success, but until you actually trial an intervention and evaluate it appropriately, you can't know if it's going to be effective.
That segues nicely into Vern's question. Would you like to speculate on where a dog's mental state might fit into all of this, as we know that dogs can suffer from a range of mental conditions that would impact their welfare?
Yeah, absolutely. Mental state is front and centre when it comes to animal welfare, and that's what I was saying before about needing to evaluate a range of different measures when we're assessing welfare, because essentially welfare is how an animal feels, and that mental state is a huge part of that. So yes, we have a lot of dogs with things like anxiety and depression and different mental issues, which are definitely going to be impacting them, and also impacting the applicability of interventions to them. If I'm telling you to go and walk your dog daily, but your dog is depressed or reactive to other dogs and anxious when it's out on the walk, that's not going to be good for its welfare if you're putting it in situations that it's anxious. So I guess the broad answer to that is yes, mental experiences are 100% important. But yeah, they're incredibly individual, particularly for dogs, in which we've got so many different situations. Like with farms, you've got one person looking after thousands of animals, whereas with dogs, we have individual people looking after individual dogs. We have so much variability in the dog population.
Thank you, Carmen. Fabulous work. And your comments about farms is a nice segue to my question. My question is about the challenges of the field research in this area. And I know when we do on-farm work, and we want to work with farms in relation to animal welfare, often the farmers who volunteer are quite interested in the optimal management of their animals anyway. I'm wondering, is that a challenge you face in this area, or is actually dog welfare more complex in the sense that perhaps some people might be quite well-meaning towards their dogs, but actually the welfare outcomes may not be always the same?
Absolutely. I'm sure you all know people who are super well-meaning in their care for their dogs, but there may be, they may have quite significant issues. And that's why, I had that suspicion that, okay, maybe those duty beliefs and that sort of thing isn't the primary motivator. It's whether they're aware of what's going on, whether they can read their dog and that sort of thing. So yes, in that aspect, it is very complex. I'm not sure if I'd say it's more complex than farm, because I haven't worked specifically in that area. but yeah, it is very, very complex. What was the other part of your question?
I was really whether that means that the people selecting.
Oh, the sampling bias thing. Yeah, absolutely. So, sampling bias is 100% an issue in a lot of research. As I said, a lot of this stuff we do convenience samples. But this is where we kind of are switching from kind of looking at that really extreme end of the spectrum, like cruelty and neglect, to looking more at this sort of mediocre middle where, you know, people might be motivated to engage in an intervention or something like that and get some more education or be part of a program, but their dogs still have problems of some sort because they need that upskilling or that extra help. So yeah, I think it's both a problem when it comes to that more extreme end of things, but we also have a lot to do in that middle zone as well anyway.
That segues well into Nicole's question. Were there any investigations into the socioeconomic status of the owners?
For the last study, no. For the first study, for the first two studies, it was really the community level. So we took into account, as I said, those regional cities were quite low socioeconomic areas, and we 100% recognise that is a big contributor. I'm also really interested in the variability within that, in terms of, you know, we spoke to people in those really low socioeconomic areas through our focus groups, and a lot of them talked about having significant resource constraints and that sort of thing, but they were so committed to their animals that they would feed their animals first before they would feed themselves. So it's so variable. There's just such a range.
The second part of Nicole's question is good. As an inspector, we often see these impacts on people's mental health and their ability to care for animals. Often people we come across have mental health problems. Is there any research on this aspect of animal welfare in relation to human mental health?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research on this sort of pet effect stuff around the benefits of pets and that sort of thing. There's been a lot less work done on that sort of mental illness and issues around that. I think that is a really important thing, in that, you know, if you do have a mental illness and you are trying to care for your animal and you're failing at that as well, you know, that's got to be a huge impact on your mental health as well. So I think that's an incredibly important area. I'm not sure that I don't think there's been much done on that, but please, anyone correct me if I'm wrong. But I definitely see that is incredibly important. Yeah.
Do we have any final questions from the audience? In that case, I might just thank Professor Coleman for his introduction for Carmen, and on behalf of everyone online and here today, congratulate Carmen. And thank you to everyone who joined us in person and everyone who zoomed in today. We might finish up there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.